Good afternoon, and welcome to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration educational webinar on allergen labeling for retail food stores and food service establishments. I am Diana Monaco with the FDA's Human Foods Program, Office of Communication, Education, and Engagement. In a moment, I will turn the call over to Lynn Zybis, Director, Division of Food Labeling and Standards, Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling in the Human Foods Program, Nutrition Center of Excellence. She will begin the presentation and will be joined by Linda Cox and Mabel Lee, both consumer safety officers within the Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling in the Human Foods Program, Nutrition Center of Excellence. They will provide an overview on FDA's labeling and food allergen labeling requirements. After the presentation, we will move to the question and answer portion of the call. With that, I will now turn the call over to Lynn Zybis.
Thank you for the introduction, Diana. My name is Lynn Zybis, and together with Linda Cox and Mabel Lee, we will provide an overview on FDA's food labeling and food allergen labeling requirements. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information to industry stakeholders, including retail, food store, and food service establishments like grocery stores, who repackage or relabel food products that are regulated by FDA. The topics for today's discussion will include some general food labeling requirements and then focus on major food allergen labeling requirements. Then we will cover the provisions of Section 403W of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and discuss how to declare major food allergens on packaged foods before touching on compliance and allergen advisory statements. We will end with some questions and answers. Let's start with some general labeling requirements for foods regulated by FDA. As mentioned, this webinar is intended for retailers and food service establishments. FDA's food labeling requirements are found in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations and in Section 403 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The labeling requirements in the FDA Food Code are aligned with these requirements. While we will not be talking about the food code requirements in this webinar, it's important to note that the federal labeling requirements in today's discussion will apply regardless of whether state, territories, or local jurisdictions have adopted the food code. The requirements discussed in this webinar apply to packaged foods and do not apply to unpackaged foods, such as foods wrapped behind the counter by a food service employee in response to a consumer request. When we talk about the general food labeling requirements, the major requirements for packaged foods include the statement of identity or the name of the food, the net quantity of contents, the nutrition facts label unless exempt, the name and place of business, a complete ingredient list including artificial flavors, colors, or chemical preservatives, and major food allergens if applicable. Note that for an ingredient which itself contains 2 or more ingredients, the common or usual name of the sub-ingredients must also be declared on the label. These required labeling elements must be provided in English unless the food is only distributed in a U.S. territory where the predominant language is one other than English, such as Puerto Rico. Additionally, mandatory labeling for packaged food may not be replaced by QR code or website labeling. If you receive food from a manufacturer that you relabel or repackage into smaller units for retail sale, or you prepare foods in-house that you package and label for retail sale, you are responsible for making sure that the labels you put on the food are consistent with the labeling information provided by the manufacturer and are in compliance with all of FDA's applicable labeling requirements, including the ingredient and allergen labeling. In other words, the store or food service establishment is responsible for making sure that the food is not misbranded. For example, in this illustration, a food establishment repackages a bulk snack food into clear clamshells and places their own label on the product. The snack manufacturer provides the required labeling for their bulk products, and the retail food establishment is responsible for putting the correct label information on the finished package of the snack product for the consumer. Next, we will focus specifically on the food allergen labeling requirements.
Thank you, Lynn. Continuing on, let's take a deeper dive into the requirements for food allergen labeling. To get us started, I'll provide a brief introduction to food allergies. Food allergies affect millions of Americans and their families. Food allergies occur when the body's immune system reacts to certain proteins in food. Food allergic reactions vary in severity from mild symptoms involving hives and lip swelling to severe, life-threatening symptoms, often called anaphylaxis, that may involve fatal respiratory problems and shock. While promising prevention and therapeutic strategies are being developed, food allergies currently cannot be cured. Early recognition and learning how to manage food allergies, including which foods to avoid, are important measures to prevent serious health consequences. To protect those with food allergies and other food sensitivities, the FDA enforces regulations requiring companies to list ingredients on packaged foods and beverages. FDA provides guidance to consumers and other stakeholders on ways to assess and manage food allergen hazards in food. Now I'll talk about the U.S. food allergen labeling requirements by starting with the passage of the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act in 2004, which we called FALCPA. FALCPA amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It defined major food allergens and required that the label of a food that contains an ingredient that is or contains protein from a major food allergen declare the presence of the allergen in the manner described by the law. At the time, FALCPA defined 8 major food allergens: milk, eggs, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soybeans. Congress passed this act to make it easier for food allergic consumers and their caregivers to identify and avoid foods that contain major food allergens. As Lynn noted, FDA always required a complete list of ingredients for food labeling. However, ingredients considered incidental additives, flavors, and colors did not explicitly have to declare if they contained a major food allergen. Further, FDA requires that foods have to be declared by their common or usual name in the list of ingredients. However, the common or usual name of an ingredient does not always indicate the major food allergen from which it is derived. For example, the term milk is more commonly understood by consumers than whey, which is a milk protein. FALCPA changed this by requiring that incidental additives, flavors, and colors that are or contain a major food allergen must declare that allergen on the label, and that the source of the major food allergen must be declared, not just the common or usual name. One unique aspect of FALCPA is that it was self-implementing, which meant that we did not have to develop any regulations. We just had to enforce the legal requirement, which automatically became effective for any food labeled after January 1st, 2006. A food that did not comply with the allergen labeling requirements was deemed misbranded and would be subject to FDA enforcement action. Then came the passage of the Food Allergen Safety, Treatment, Education, and Research Act, or FASTER Act, which amended the food allergen labeling requirements to include sesame as the 9th allergen. This law took effect on January 1st, 2023, and it was also self-implementing like FALCPA. Since FALCPA and FASTER Act both amended the FD&C Act, we will reference these collectively as the food allergen labeling requirements of the FD&C Act. The law provides a 2-part definition for a major food allergen. First, a major food allergen means the following 9 foods or food groups: milk, egg, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, wheat, peanuts, soybeans, and sesame. Second, a major food allergen means a food ingredient that contains a protein derived from one of these foods, with the following exceptions: a highly refined oil derived from one of these foods or an ingredient derived from such a highly refined oil, raw agricultural commodities, and a food ingredient exempt under a petition or notification process specified in the law under Section 403W of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The FD&C Act applies to all FDA-regulated packaged foods, including dietary supplements. This means that all ingredients that either are or contain a major food allergen are subject to the food allergen labeling requirements of the FD&C Act, including incidental additives, flavors, and colors. Congress established the list of major food allergens, and FDA cannot alter the list. It is important that food packaging at all points in the supply chain appropriately lists the presence of all major food allergens so that individuals with food allergies can avoid products that may cause them serious and life-threatening harm. The food allergen labeling requirements in the FD&C Act apply to all domestically manufactured and imported packaged foods regulated by FDA, including foods packaged by retail or food service establishments. Retail food stores and food service establishments are responsible for ensuring that the labels for food manufactured or sold under their brand name and any labeling that they perform in-house or in their food service establishment is accurate with respect to allergens. The FDA Model Food Code, which is the primary resource for compliance and enforcement of food safety provisions, information regarding food allergens in retail food establishment, emphasizes that items packaged at retail for sale to consumers must declare the major food allergens they contain on the label in accordance with the FD&C Act. The food allergen labeling requirements in the Act apply to all packaged foods regulated by FDA, including foods packaged by retail and food service establishments, regardless of whether their jurisdictions have adopted the food code. Again, these labeling requirements do not apply to foods provided by a retail or food service establishment that are placed in a wrapper or container in response to a consumer's order, such as the paper or box used to transport a sandwich that has been prepared in response to a consumer's order. There's information in the food code for unpackaged foods. Here is an example of a retail store label. We want to reiterate that the food allergen labeling requirements in the Act apply to all packaged foods regulated by FDA, including food packaged by retail and food service establishments, regardless of whether their jurisdictions have adopted the food code. Consumers need to know what ingredients are used in the packaged foods they purchase. This is critical for consumers with food allergies, since their life and health depends on knowing and trusting that the product labels clearly list all major food allergens. With that, we will cover the provisions of Section 403W of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in more details. Under Section 403W of the Act, food products that contain an ingredient that is or contains a protein from a major food allergen must be labeled in one of two ways. The first option would be to include the name of the allergen in the list of ingredients, or the allergen food source in parentheses following the common or usual name of the major food allergen in the list of ingredients, such as whey, parentheses, milk. The second option would be to use a contains statement. This would have the word contains followed by the name of the food sources of all the major food allergens in that food. The names of the food sources must be the same as those specified in Section 201 of the Act. This statement should be printed immediately after or adjacent to the list of ingredients. So as you can see, you don't have to have a contains statement. If a manufacturer lists the name of the allergen in the ingredient list, but still wishes to have a contains statement, then the contains statement would have to be complete. This means the contains statement would have to list all the allergens present in the food. For tree nuts, fish, and crustacean shellfish, the specific type of nuts or species of fish and crustacean shellfish must be included. Maybe we'll talk more about these examples in a little bit. Note that molluscan shellfish, like clams and oysters, are not major food allergens. Continuing on with provisions of Section 403W of the Act, food allergen labeling must be on the label and not just on the labeling. As I mentioned before, flavoring, coloring, or incidental additives, that bear or contain a major food allergen would have to declare the presence of any major food allergen. And finally, the Act only applies to ingredients that are intentionally added to the food. Allergens cannot be included in the ingredient list or contain statement unless it is an ingredient in the food. Allergens that are present due to cross-contact are not addressed in the food allergen labeling requirements of the Act. Title 21 CFR Part 117 defines allergen cross-contact as the unintentional incorporation of a food allergen into a food. Please note that we use the phrase cross-contact instead of cross-contamination with respect to allergens.
Now that we have gone over the provisions in Section 403W of the Act, let's see how to declare major food allergens on the label. Here are the two options for declaring allergens. Option 1, within the list of ingredients, the common or usual name of a major food allergen is immediately followed parenthetically by the name of its food source, such as whey, in parentheses, milk. Or option 2, in a separate summary statement immediately following or adjacent to the list of ingredients, the word contains is followed by the name of the food source of each major food allergen in the product, such as contains milk. The contain statement must be printed immediately after or adjacent to the ingredient list, in a type size no smaller than the type size used for the ingredient list. If the food source is declared in the ingredient list and a contain statement is also used, then the food source of all the major food allergens present in the food needs to be declared in the contain statement, even if they are already declared in the ingredient list. For option 1, the allergen declaration is within the ingredient list. This slide illustrates two examples of how major food allergens are declared. The major food allergens are encircled in red for illustrative purposes. In the first ingredient list, note that the major food allergens are part of the common or usual name of the ingredients, except for the term egg, which is stated parenthetically after the ingredient name albumin. In the second ingredient list, all of the allergen names except for soy and milk are declared parenthetically following the ingredient name. The term wheat is stated parenthetically after the ingredient flour. The term egg, again, is stated parenthetically after the ingredient albumin. And the term peanut is also stated parenthetically after the ingredient natural flavor. Here, we have more examples for option 1. The two examples shown on this slide illustrate ingredient labels that already meet allergen labeling requirements without a separate contain statement or the parenthetical allergen source name within the ingredient list. In the first example, the common or usual names of the allergenic ingredients, whole wheat flour, buttermilk, and peanut butter, already identified by their food source names. In the second example, there are two milk-derived allergenic ingredients, non-fat dry milk and whey. The food source name of each major food allergen used as an ingredient to make a packaged food is required to be declared only once within the ingredient list. It is not necessary to parenthetically repeat the food source name milk after the ingredient name whey. For option 2, using a contain statement to declare major food allergens. This example label illustrates the use of a separate contain statement to identify the food source names of all major food allergens used as ingredients. The formatting and wording of a contain statement featured in this example is very simple and straightforward and uses a minimal amount of space. It reads, contains milk, wheat, soy, egg, peanuts. This example shows the placement of the contain statement immediately following the ingredient list on a separate line. The separate contain statement may make allergens more distinctive and easier to read by the consumer. The use of bolded text and punctuation within a contain statement is optional. To summarize, here are examples of 3 ways that allergens can be declared. In the first example on the top left, milk and soy are declared as part of the common or usual name of the ingredients, but wheat, egg, and peanut are not. So they are declared in parentheses after the common or usual name of the ingredients. In the second example, on the top right, instead of declaring the source names of the allergens in the ingredient list in parentheses, like in the first example, the major food allergens are declared in the contain statement. In the third example at the bottom, in the ingredient list, wheat and milk are declared as ingredients, and egg is declared in parentheses next to ovoalbumin, and consumers are made aware that the natural flavor is made from peanuts. I hope these examples help visualize different ways to meet the food allergen labeling requirements. That leads us to the next topic on compliance.
Let's start with some examples of common allergen labeling violations we see on food labels. First, not listing allergenic subingredients in the ingredient statement. For example, declaring mayonnaise as an ingredient, but failing to declare egg as a component of the mayonnaise, or declaring cheese in an ingredient statement, but failing to declare the subingredient milk. Next, not including the name of the food source, such as declaring the ingredient whey without declaring milk, or not declaring the name of the species of fish or type of tree nut. Sometimes firms may use foreign terms, such as listing groundnuts instead of peanuts, or listing edamame but failing to declare soy. In some cases, there is no label at all on the packaged food. And finally, there have been many recalls due to manufacturing errors, such as using the wrong label or adding an incorrect ingredient to a product. The FDA conducts inspections and sampling to verify that major food allergens are properly labeled on products and to determine whether food facilities implement proper controls to prevent allergen cross-contact and labeling controls to prevent undeclared allergens during manufacturing and packaging. Allergen labeling violations can lead to a variety of FDA compliance actions, such as recalls, warning letters, import refusals, detention without physical examination, seizure, and injunction. FDA has issued warning letters to firms, including retail food chains, that have not complied with the FDA's major food allergen labeling requirements. When problems are found, the FDA works with firms to recall products and provide public notification to immediately alert consumers. FDA also has mandatory recall authority when the allergen labeling violation presents a reasonable likelihood of serious adverse health consequences or death to humans, and the firm does not initiate a voluntary recall. Recent data indicate that errors in allergen labeling are occurring too frequently in the packaged food sector. For example, the FDA review of allergen-related recalls from 2013 to 2019 has shown that undeclared food allergens are a leading cause of Class 1 food recalls, and labeling-related errors are the most common cause for these recalls. The top 4 root causes are allergen labeling information from ingredients not carried through to the finished product label, product was placed in the wrong package, an incorrect label was used or applied on product package, an incorrect or incomplete terminology was used, such as butter was declared, but the major food allergen milk was not. As noted earlier, if the major food allergens are declared in the ingredient list and a contain statement is also used, the contain statement needs to include all of the major food allergens in the food. In this example, some allergens are declared in the ingredient list and others are in the contain statement. This is considered an incomplete contain statement. Incomplete contain statements may be misleading because some consumers may only read the contain statement if they see one, or be confused if it is inconsistent with the ingredient statement. In this example, the contain statement includes milk, wheat, soy, and egg, even though the milk and soy are already declared in the ingredient list. As previously discussed, tree nuts, fish, and crustacean shellfish must identify the specific type of tree nut and fish or crustacean shellfish species. In these examples, use of the terms tree nuts or fish are common mistakes we see on food labels. The food allergen labeling requirements of the Act require the specific type of tree nuts, such as almonds, walnuts, pecans, or the specific fish or crustacean shellfish species, such as salmon or shrimp. We often see allergen advisory statements on packaged food labels. As mentioned earlier, food allergen labeling requirements of the FDA Act only apply to intentionally added ingredients. They do not apply to major food allergens that are unintentionally incorporated in a food as a result of cross-contact during manufacturing. For example, in some situations, there may be presence of ingredients carried over due to shared equipment or facilities. In the context of food allergens, cross-contact occurs when an allergenic food is unintentionally incorporated into another food that is not intended to contain that allergenic food. In some situations, manufacturers sometimes use what is called allergen advisory statements. These statements are voluntary, so manufacturers are not required to use these labels to warn consumers of possible unavoidable presence of an allergen in a food. FDA has stated that food allergen advisory statements, like may contain or made on the same equipment, are not a substitute for adherence to current good manufacturing practices or food allergen preventive controls, and must be truthful and not misleading. We are considering ways to best manage the use of these type of statements by manufacturers to better inform consumers. Now I'll turn it back to Diana for the questions and answers portion.
Well, thank you, Linda and Mabel, for your presentations. At this time, we will move into the question and answers portion of the webinar. Many of the questions we received during the registration process were addressed in the webinar. However, here are some additional questions based on the submissions we received. The first question we'll start with is, we make and package products in-house based on ingredients on hand. As such, ingredients and allergens may vary with each batch. Can the label declare all possible major food allergens that may be used?
Thank you, Diana. The response to this question is, product labels are required to accurately declare the ingredients used to manufacture the food product. The allergen labeling requirements of the Act do not provide for a catch-all listing of all possible major food allergens if they are not actually present in the product. This practice also limits the choice of food allergic consumers.
Thank you very much, Mabel. Question 2, is the manufacturer responsible for providing accurate information on ingredients and allergens to retail stores and food service establishments? In part 2 of that question, can I carry over the supplier's allergen declaration?
Thank you, Diana. In response to this question, yes. Manufacturers are responsible for labeling bulk foods that they sell to retail stores and food service establishments in accordance with the labeling requirements of the Act. If your repackaging process does not add additional major food allergens to the finished product, you can carry over the supplier's allergen declaration from the supplier's label, provided that you have verified that all major food allergens are properly declared. You are responsible for making sure that the labels you put on the food are consistent with the label information provided by the manufacturer of the product and are in compliance with all of FDA's applicable labeling requirements, including the ingredient and allergen labeling. In other words, a store or food service establishment that is labeling a food product is responsible for making sure that the food is not misbranded.
And thank you, Mabel. Question number 3, if we have a temporary change in formulation where an ingredient is substituted and now contains a major food allergen, Can we use a sticker label for the ingredient list and contains statement?
Thank you, Diana. In response to this question, a sticker label may be used for the ingredient list and the contain statement if it completely covers the incorrect ingredient list and contain statement.
We would like to thank everyone for submitting your questions. While we don't have time to address all of them as part of this webinar, before we close, we want to leave you with some useful links that may answer additional questions that have not been addressed. For more information on allergen labeling, there are some useful links on our FDA website. Please note that we are actively working on combining the two allergen Q&A guidances into one final guidance document. We received some questions regarding allergen cross-contact, which is outside the scope of this webinar. However, you can refer to the Draft Compliance Policy Guide, which covers allergen labeling violations and cross-contact. Additionally, although the Preventive Controls Draft Guidance for Industry may not be applicable to retail food establishments because they are not registered facilities, it does provide our current thinking on allergen controls and labeling, which may be helpful. We also received some questions about general food labeling requirements, such as sub-ingredient labeling. You can find more food labeling information on our Nutrition, Food Labeling, and Critical Foods main landing page and the Food Labeling Guide. Questions related to gluten and gluten-free labeling can be found on the gluten-free labeling page. Information regarding the labeling requirements for unpackaged foods in restaurants and food service establishments, such as buffets and salad bars, were outside the scope of this webinar, but we direct you to the last link for information that may be useful as a resource related to the food code. If you have additional questions, please contact the Food and Cosmetic Information Center in the Human Foods Program by submitting a web inquiry, online chat, or calling 1-888-SAFE-FOOD between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Eastern Time. All the links provided in this presentation can be found in the YouTube description box below.
Thank you, Lynn. And we all want to thank you for your time and attention to this webinar and hope you find the information we have provided helpful. This concludes today's webinar. A recording will be available on the FDA's meeting webpage shortly. Thank you and goodbye.